I want to care for my sick Apache neighbor. By morning, everyone asked, "What happened last night?" The town sat far from busy roads, surrounded by dry land and wide skies that seemed to stretch forever. People there lived quietly, following simple routines. Everyone knew everyone, but most kept their distance. They greeted each other with small nods and short talks, then returned to their own lives. In this town, nothing much changed, and that was how people liked it. At the edge of the town stood an old wooden house, weathered by sun and time. That house belonged to an elderly Apache man named Thomas. He had lived there longer than most people could remember. Some said he had moved there decades ago. Others believed his family had been on that land long before the town even had a name. No one really knew the full truth, because Thomas spoke very little about himself. Thomas was polite but distant. He waved when someone passed by, sometimes offered a short smile but rarely joined conversations. He walked slowly, using a stick, and spent long hours sitting outside his house, watching the sky or the land around him. People respected him, even if they didn't fully understand him. There was something calm and serious about the way he carried himself. The main character of the story, Daniel, lived 2 houses away. Daniel was in his early 30s, working small jobs, helping where he could. He was not close to Thomas, but he had helped him once or twice with groceries or small repairs. Their conversations were brief, usually just a few words. Still, Daniel always felt that Thomas noticed more than he said. One evening, just as the sun was sinking low and painting the sky orange and red, Daniel heard a knock on his door. It was Mrs. Harper, an older woman who seemed to know everything that happened in town. Her face looked worried. "Daniel," she said, "Thomas is not well. He's been sick all day. He has no family here. We tried calling the clinic, but they can't come until morning. Someone needs to stay with him tonight." Daniel felt a sudden heaviness in his chest. He had plans to rest that night. He was tired from work, and the idea of caring for a sick man made him uneasy. Still, when he thought of Thomas alone in that old house, something inside him would not let him say no. "I'll go," Daniel said quietly. Mrs. Harper looked relieved. "Thank you. Just keep an eye on him. He doesn't like crowds." Daniel grabbed a jacket and a small bag with water and snacks, then walked toward Thomas's house. The air felt cooler now, and the town was unusually silent. No dogs barked. No radios played. Even the wind seemed to move gently, as if not to disturb anything. As Daniel reached the house, he noticed the door was slightly open. A dim light glowed inside. He knocked softly and stepped in after hearing a weak voice tell him to enter. The inside of the house smelled of old wood and herbs. The furniture was simple and worn but clean. There were a few handmade items on the walls and shelves, small carvings, faded photographs, and objects Daniel didn't recognize. The place felt lived in, but also heavy with time. Thomas lay on a bed near the window, covered with blankets. His face looked pale and his breathing was slow but uneven. When he saw Daniel, his eyes opened slightly and he gave a small nod. "You came," Thomas said, his voice rough but calm. "Yes," Daniel replied. "I'm here to help." Thomas did not smile, but his eyes softened. "Sit," he said, pointing to a chair. Daniel sat down, unsure what else to do. He checked the water by the bed and adjusted the blanket when Thomas shivered. The old man closed his eyes, breathing deeply, as if gathering strength. Minutes passed in silence. Daniel could hear the ticking of an old clock and the soft sounds of the night outside. Every now and then, Thomas shifted or muttered something under his breath. Some words Daniel understood. Others sounded unfamiliar, spoken in a language Daniel had never learned. As the darkness outside grew deeper, Daniel began to feel strange. Not afraid exactly, but alert, as if the house itself was aware of him. He told himself it was just his imagination. He focused on his task, reminding himself that people get sick and nights like this happen. Thomas suddenly spoke again, his eyes still closed. "This land remembers," he said quietly. Daniel looked up, surprised. "What do you mean?" he asked. Thomas did not answer right away. His breathing steadied, and for a moment Daniel thought he had fallen asleep. Then the old man spoke again, softer this time. "People come and go, stories stay." Daniel did not know how to respond, so he simply nodded, even though Thomas could not see him. He felt that the words were not meant to start a conversation, but to state something important. Outside, the moon rose slowly, casting pale light through the window. Shadows moved gently across the room. Daniel shifted in his chair, trying to stay comfortable. He checked his phone, but there was no signal. That did not surprise him. The town often lost connection at night. As hours passed, Thomas's condition seemed to change. Sometimes he appeared restless, speaking in broken sentences, his voice filled with emotion. At other times he was calm, almost peaceful. Daniel listened carefully, offering water when needed, staying close. At one point, Thomas opened his eyes and looked directly at Daniel. His gaze was sharp, focused, as if he were seeing something beyond the room. "You didn't have to come," Thomas said. Daniel shrugged. "Someone had to." Thomas studied him for a long moment. "Not everyone would." That simple sentence stayed with Daniel. He realized that this night was not just about helping a sick neighbor. There was something deeper happening, something he could not yet explain. The night continued to stretch on, slow and quiet. Daniel felt tired, but he refused to leave. He watched over Thomas, unaware that this simple act of staying would soon become something the whole town would talk about. And as the hours passed, the silence of the house seemed to grow thicker, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something that had not yet revealed itself. The night grew deeper, and the small house seemed even quieter. The world outside felt distant, as if it had disappeared completely. Daniel kept sitting near Thomas, who was still lying on the bed. The old man's breathing came in slow, uneven waves. Sometimes it was steady, sometimes shallow and rapid. Each change made Daniel uneasy, but he forced himself to remain calm. He had learned that panicking would not help anyone. The house felt alive in a strange way. The wooden floorboards creaked under the smallest movement, and sometimes Daniel thought he heard faint whispers, though no one else was there. Shadows from the flickering lamps stretched across the walls and ceiling, moving slowly like drifting clouds. He told himself it was just the lamp, just the old house settling, but the feeling lingered, curling around the corners of his mind. Thomas stirred suddenly. His eyes opened just enough to see Daniel leaning forward in his chair. He spoke in a voice that was almost a whisper, but Daniel could hear every word clearly. "Do you hear them?" Thomas asked. Daniel frowned. "Hear who?" "The stories, they never stop." Daniel blinked. He had not expected such words. "Stories," he repeated. Thomas nodded weakly. "All around us. This land holds them. Every tree, every rock, every step, someone has left a memory here." Daniel did not know what to say. He had never thought about the land that way. To him, it was dry, open, ordinary. But Thomas's voice carried a weight that made the room feel different, heavier somehow, like the air itself held secrets. Daniel simply nodded. "I understand," he said, even though he was not sure he did. The old man closed his eyes again, but this time he did not drift into sleep. Instead, he muttered more words under his breath, sometimes in English, sometimes in the Apache language. Daniel tried to catch the meaning, but many of the words were unfamiliar. He listened carefully, not wanting to interrupt. There was something in Thomas's tone that demanded attention. Hours passed. The night outside stretched endlessly, the moon slowly climbing higher. Daniel's arms ached from sitting in one position, his legs cramped, but he refused to move too far from the bed. Each time Thomas shifted slightly, Daniel leaned forward to adjust the blanket or offer water. He became aware of how small gestures could matter so much to someone in pain. At one point, Thomas spoke more clearly. "Do you know about the river?" he asked. Daniel shook his head. "Which river?" Thomas smiled faintly, almost like a ghost of a smile. "The one that used to run here before the town came. It carried more than water. It carried life and sorrow and everything in between." Daniel listened, fascinated despite the exhaustion weighing down his body. He realized that Thomas was not speaking about ordinary things. These were memories, lessons, fragments of a life that no one had asked to hear, but that needed to be shared. Sometimes, Thomas spoke of people who had lived and left, of families that were torn apart, of moments that seemed small but changed everything. Daniel realized that this night was becoming more than just sitting with a sick neighbor. It was becoming a lesson in history, memory, and human endurance. Outside, the wind began to rise. It rattled the window panes softly, and the branches of the nearby trees scraped against the walls. Daniel felt a shiver run down his spine, but he reminded himself that it was just the wind. Yet, there was something in the way the house seemed to react that made him pause. Each sound, each shadow felt deliberate, as if the house itself were listening to the stories being told inside. Thomas shifted again, his voice weaker now. "Do you see them?" he asked. Daniel frowned. "See who? The ones who stayed, the ones who left." "They never leave completely." Daniel hesitated. I don't understand." Thomas opened his eyes slightly and looked at Daniel with a steady gaze. "Some stories are alive. They follow the land, they follow people. When you stay with someone, when you listen, you let those stories breathe. Tonight, you are breathing with them." Daniel did not know what to say. The old man's words were strange, almost like a puzzle. Yet there was truth in them, a feeling that made Daniel's chest tighten. He realized that this night, which had begun as a simple act of helping, was becoming something profound, something he could never explain to anyone else. Time moved slowly. Daniel kept checking on Thomas, making sure he had water, adjusting the blankets when the old man shivered, and speaking softly to calm him. At moments, Thomas would drift into silence, almost like sleep, but then he would murmur again, sharing fragments of his life. Daniel listened, even when he did not understand. There was something sacred in simply being there, in witnessing the night with someone who had carried so much history in his bones. At one point, Daniel noticed Thomas's breathing become shallow. He leaned closer, ready to help if needed. The old man's eyes opened slowly, and he spoke in a voice that seemed almost tired of words. "Do not leave," he said. Daniel shook his head. "I'm not going anywhere." Thomas's eyes closed, and he breathed deeply, almost as if relieved that someone was staying. Daniel sat back in his chair, exhausted but unable to relax completely. There was a feeling in the air, something unspoken, like the moment before a storm or the quiet tension before a revelation. Minutes passed. Daniel's thoughts wandered. He thought about his life, his routine, the small concerns that seemed important during the day. Now, in the quiet of this house, those concerns felt small, almost meaningless. He realized that life was larger than what he had imagined, filled with stories, pain, joy, and experiences that connected people in ways he could barely understand. At one point, Thomas began speaking more rapidly, though his words were still soft. He spoke of family, of loss, of moments he wished he could forget, and moments he could never forget. Daniel leaned closer, trying to catch every word. He realized that this night was not just a night. It was a bridge between the past and the present, a space where the unseen threads of life could reveal themselves. Outside, the moon reached its highest point, flooding the room with pale light. Shadows stretched across the walls, shifting with the slow flicker of the lamp. Daniel felt both tired and awake, as if the night had opened something inside him he could not yet name. He kept sitting there, listening, offering comfort, doing nothing extraordinary, and yet he sensed that this night would stay with him forever. Thomas spoke again, his voice weaker now. "You are not like the others. Most would leave. Most would not care, but you stayed." Daniel shook his head, feeling a strange emotion well up inside him. "I'm just helping," he said softly. Thomas's eyes opened slightly. Helping is seeing, helping is listening. That is more than most understand. Daniel looked around the room at the small carvings on the shelves, the faded photographs on the walls, the small details of a life that had passed through decades. He realized that Thomas's life, quiet as it had been, carried meaning far beyond what anyone could see. And tonight he was part of it. The hours continued, slow and deliberate. Daniel's eyes grew heavy, but he stayed alert. Thomas would speak in fragments, pause, then speak again. Each word seemed to carry weight, a small piece of history, a secret, or a memory. Daniel realized that he was not just helping a sick neighbor, he was witnessing a life, a history, a story that had been waiting for someone to listen. And as the night deepened further, Daniel understood something important. Some nights are not ordinary. Some nights carry a weight that is unseen but real, a quiet power that changes the people who live through them. And this night, with Thomas lying there quietly, was one of those nights. By the time the first hints of dawn appeared on the horizon, the house was still quiet. Daniel leaned back in his chair, tired but awake, feeling the weight of the night and the stories it had carried. He did not yet know what the morning would bring, or how the town would react. But he knew, deep inside, that he had experienced something unusual, something profound, and that this night would not be forgotten for him, or perhaps for Thomas. The night was slowly giving way to a pale gray light on the horizon, though the sun had not yet risen. The air inside Thomas's house was still thick with the quiet weight of the night. Daniel had long stopped noticing the ticking of the old clock or the shifting shadows on the walls. He was focused entirely on Thomas, who had begun to speak more clearly now, as if the silence of the hours had given him the courage to share what he had carried for decades. Thomas's breathing was steadier than it had been earlier, though his body was still weak. He opened his eyes, those deep, dark eyes that seemed to hold both the sorrow of the past and the wisdom of years lived fully. Daniel leaned in closer, unsure of how much the old man could speak, yet eager to listen. "They called it loss," Thomas began softly, almost as if speaking to himself. "Not everyone understands what that means. Not just losing a family or losing a friend. Losing a part of yourself that you can never get back. That is the kind of loss I carry." Daniel stayed silent, letting the words fill the room. He had helped sick people before, but he had never felt the weight of someone's life in this way. Every word Thomas spoke seemed heavy with history, yet gentle, as if he were placing pieces of a lifetime into Daniel's hands. "I was young when they left," Thomas continued. "The land, my people, the world shifted and I could not stop it. I tried, I fought, I prayed. But some things cannot be fixed by hands or words. They are carried in memory like shadows you cannot escape." Daniel's heart ached for him. He had expected to spend the night giving water, adjusting blankets, and keeping company. He had not expected to feel the depth of someone else's life, to become part of it even in silence. Yet here he was, sitting near the bed, absorbing every fragment Thomas offered. Thomas shifted slightly, raising a hand weakly toward a small shelf where old photographs and carvings were placed. "Do you see these?" he asked. "These are pieces of stories. People you may never meet, places that may not exist anymore. I have kept them because memory is all we have when the world moves too fast." Daniel looked at the photographs, faded with age. Some were of families he had never seen, some of places that were unrecognizable even as he studied them. The carvings depicted animals, mountains, rivers, and faces. Each one seemed simple at first, but Daniel realized that they were made with care, as if each piece carried a life, a lesson, or a warning. "They tell stories," Thomas said softly. "Every piece matters, every detail matters. If you listen, you might understand a little." But most people never listen. They rush past life without noticing. Daniel felt a chill, not from cold, but from the weight of the words. He realized that this night was not just about helping a sick man. It was about being trusted with his life story, about being allowed to see the world through someone else's eyes. Thomas's voice became weaker, but more urgent. "Do you understand what it means to be responsible for someone else's story?" Daniel hesitated. I think I do," he said quietly. "I'll stay, I'll listen." The old man's eyes softened slightly. "Good," he said, "because tonight you are the only one who can hear it." The only one. And so the room fell into a quieter silence, not empty but full of presence. Thomas's breathing became slower, more rhythmic. Daniel watched him, noticing the rise and fall of his chest, the way his fingers curled slightly around the blanket. He thought of the night outside, the town still asleep and the wind whispering through the trees. Everything felt connected, the land, the house, the stories, the two of them in that quiet space. Hours passed like this. Thomas spoke in fragments, sometimes clear, sometimes in the Apache language, sharing names, places, and events that Daniel could barely understand. Yet he listened, letting the words enter him without needing to fully grasp them. There was something sacred in listening, he realized, in being present for someone else's life without judgment or interruption. At one point, Thomas's voice softened further. "There is a river," he said. "It runs through memory, through time. You cannot see it, but it flows. It carries everything: love, sorrow, joy, regret. When you are willing to stay with someone, you step into that river, even for a moment." Daniel felt the words sink deep into him. He had never thought of life in this way, not as a river, but as a flow of moments, some bright, some dark, some carrying lessons that could not be forgotten. And now, in this quiet room, he was floating alongside someone else's memories, part of a flow that had existed long before he was born. Thomas paused, breathing slowly. Then, with a faint smile, he spoke again. "Do you know the hardest part?" Daniel shook his head. "No, sir." "I don't. The hardest part," Thomas said, "is remembering when everyone else has forgotten. You carry the past in your mind, in your heart, in your bones, while the world keeps moving forward unaware." Daniel understood. He had felt it before in small ways when someone passed or a place changed, leaving only traces of what had been. But hearing it from Thomas in this room, with the weight of years pressing down, made it something larger, almost overwhelming. And yet, there was also peace. Daniel realized that being present, being awake to someone else's life, allowed him to share in that peace. The night was no longer frightening. It was alive with stories, with history, with life itself. Outside, the first hints of light began to touch the edges of the sky. The night had carried them both through hours of memory and presence. Daniel realized that Thomas's voice had grown steadier, calmer. The old man's breathing was smoother, almost like sleep, but deeper, more restful than before. Thomas spoke one last time before drifting quietly. "You have stayed, you have listened, that is enough. You will carry it now, even if you do not know it yet." Daniel nodded, understanding without words. He sat quietly, watching the room, the objects, the man who had shared so much of himself. There was a sense of completion, as if the night had reached a turning point and the weight of the hours now settled gently over them. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was not empty. It was full of what had been shared, full of memory, full of the quiet understanding that sometimes, simply being present is enough to change a life. Daniel's thoughts drifted to the town outside, to the people who would wake soon, unaware of the night that had passed in the old house. He realized that what had happened here would remain between him and Thomas, a secret carried quietly, like a small flame in the darkness. And as the first full light of dawn approached, Daniel felt a sense of calm he had never known before. The night had been long, tiring, even frightening at times, but it had also been extraordinary. He had witnessed a lifetime in fragments, had been trusted with stories that could not be told to anyone else, and had found a deeper understanding of life, of history, and of the quiet power of simply listening. For Thomas, the night had been a moment of trust and release. For Daniel, it had been a lesson in patience, empathy, and the unexpected weight of human connection. Neither of them spoke much now, but the presence in the room spoke volumes. The night had been a bridge between past and present, between two lives that had briefly crossed in the quietest, most profound way. Daniel stayed until the light grew stronger, until he saw the first signs of the sun touching the hills in the distance. Thomas rested peacefully, breathing steadily, the tension of hours now lifted. The old house, which had seemed so heavy with shadows and silence, now felt lighter, warmer, almost alive with the quiet glow of morning. Daniel realized then that the night had changed him. He had entered the house to care for a sick neighbor, but he was leaving with something far more valuable, a deeper understanding of life, a respect for the stories people carry, and a quiet awareness of how small acts of presence can matter more than words ever could. And as he prepared to step outside, he felt a soft sense of anticipation, though he did not know why. The night had passed, but its weight lingered, and he sensed that the town, the people, and even the land itself would somehow notice, even if no one could explain how. He took a deep breath, adjusted the blanket around Thomas, and whispered softly, "Rest now. You've shared enough for one night." And with that, Daniel sat quietly, waiting for the next chapter of the morning to unfold, knowing that the night had already left its mark on him, and perhaps, in ways he did not yet understand, on everyone else as well. The first pale light of morning crept over the horizon, spilling across the dry hills and into the quiet town. Birds began to stir, calling softly to each other, and the faint hum of early life started to rise from the streets. Daniel stepped out of Thomas's house for a moment, taking a deep breath of the crisp morning air. The night had been long and heavy, filled with shadows, whispers, and stories he would never forget. Now, in the pale light, the world seemed almost normal again, but Daniel knew that what had happened inside that house would change things in ways he could not yet understand. As Daniel walked back toward the house, he noticed that the town seemed different somehow. People were outside earlier than usual. They spoke quietly to one another, their heads tilted as if listening for something that no one had yet heard. Some glanced in the direction of Thomas's house, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and unease. Daniel frowned. Had word already spread? He had expected a quiet morning, maybe a small visit from neighbors concerned about the old man, but this felt different. When he returned to Thomas's side, he saw the old man sitting up slightly, resting against the pillows. He looked calmer now, almost peaceful. Daniel adjusted the blankets carefully and offered a glass of water. Thomas accepted it slowly, taking small sips, his eyes never leaving Daniel. "You stayed," Thomas said softly. "I did," Daniel replied, smiling faintly, though exhaustion weighed on him. "I promised I would," Thomas nodded. "And now you know, you understand more than most will ever understand." Daniel did not speak. There were no words that could capture the weight of the night, the fragments of stories, the river of memory that Thomas had allowed him to step into. He simply nodded. A faint knock came at the door, and Daniel turned to see Mrs. Harper peeking inside. Her eyes widened slightly when she saw him. "Daniel," she whispered. Everyone is asking what happened last night," Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Harper shook her head. "People are saying something unusual happened. No one saw it, but everyone knows. They are asking me, and I didn't know what to tell them. They want to know if Thomas is okay. They want to know everything." Daniel realized then that the night had not been as private as he had assumed. Word had already begun to spread, carried by whispers, by intuition, by people sensing that something important had occurred. He looked at Thomas, whose eyes were calm but knowing. It seemed the old man had expected this. "Let them ask," Thomas said quietly. "Not everyone needs to know. Not everything can be explained." Daniel understood. The night had been a gift, a moment of trust between him and Thomas. It was not for the town to judge or question, yet he also realized that the curiosity of others could not be ignored. People wanted answers, and though he could not give them everything, he could share what was necessary. As the morning grew brighter, more people began to appear near Thomas's house. Neighbors, friends, and even a few strangers who had heard of his illness had come to see him. Their faces were a mixture of relief and curiosity. Some looked at Daniel with questions in their eyes, others with silent gratitude. Daniel stepped outside to greet them. "He's resting now," he said simply. "He's stable, that's all I can tell you." But the questions did not stop. "What happened last night?" one person asked. "Did something unusual happen?" another whispered. The town seemed alive with speculation, though no one could say exactly why. Daniel shook his head. "I can't say," he replied. "He asked me to stay with him, that's what I did. That's all." Even as he spoke, he felt the weight of the night pressing on him. The stories Thomas had shared, the memories, the lessons, they were now a part of him. He could not simply tell the town everything. Some things were too sacred, too heavy for casual conversation. Thomas watched quietly from the window. He had a small smile, the kind that suggested both wisdom and a touch of amusement. "Let them wonder," he said. "Let them ask." "Some nights are not meant to be understood by everyone." Daniel nodded. He realized that this was true. The night had been unique, a moment that existed outside ordinary life. Some experiences were meant to be lived, not explained. Some truths were meant to be carried quietly, like a small flame that lit the heart without revealing itself to the world. As the morning continued, Daniel helped Thomas sit up, get dressed, and have a light breakfast. The old man moved slowly, carefully, but his strength seemed to return, at least enough for him to speak and smile faintly. The house, which had felt so heavy with shadows the night before, now seemed lighter, filled with a quiet energy that came from both rest and relief. Neighbors continued to arrive, some bringing small gifts, bread, fruit, and flowers. They were polite, careful, respectful of the quiet that seemed to surround the old man. Daniel guided them gently, answering their questions as best he could without revealing too much. One neighbor, an older man named Mr. Lewis, leaned closer to Daniel and whispered, "We all felt it. Something changed here last night. I don't know how to explain it, but we know you were with him. That's all that matters." Daniel nodded silently. He understood. The night had left a mark, not visible, not tangible, but real. The town sensed it, even if they could not explain it. Something had shifted in Thomas's house, in Thomas himself, and perhaps even in the people who lived nearby. As the morning sun climbed higher, Thomas asked Daniel to sit with him once more. "You stayed when most would have left," he said. "You listened when most would not have heard. That is more important than anything anyone else could ask." Daniel smiled faintly. "I only did what felt right," he said. Thomas nodded. "And that is enough. That is all that matters." By mid-morning, the town began to settle back into its usual rhythm, though whispers of last night continued quietly from house to house. Daniel knew that people would continue to ask, continue to wonder. But he also knew that the truth of the night was private, something only he and Thomas could carry. It was not a story to be told casually, but a memory to be held quietly, with respect. As Daniel prepared to leave, Thomas reached out a hand. "Thank you," he said simply. "You have given me more than care. You have given me understanding, and that is rarer than most realize." Daniel took the hand gently. "I learned from you as well," he replied. "More than I can explain." They sat together in silence for a moment, the quiet stretching between them like a bridge built from the night's experiences. The light from the windows fell softly across the room, illuminating the carvings, the photographs, the objects that held pieces of a life long lived. Everything seemed to glow with a quiet dignity, as if the night had left a permanent mark on the house itself. When Daniel finally stepped outside, he looked back at Thomas's house one last time. The old man was sitting quietly by the window, watching him with calm eyes. Daniel felt a deep sense of gratitude, of connection, and even a small sense of awe. He had entered the house to care for someone sick, but he was leaving with something far greater, an understanding of life, of memory, and of the quiet power of presence and attention. As he walked back toward his own house, the town around him slowly returned to normal, but the air still carried a subtle tension, a sense that something extraordinary had occurred, even if no one could fully explain it. People whispered softly, eyes flicking toward Thomas's house, their voices filled with curiosity and wonder. Daniel understood that the night had changed more than just Thomas or himself. It had left a quiet mark on the entire town, a ripple of something unseen but real. And though he could not explain it, he felt certain that everyone would remember the morning, the questions, and the feeling that lingered after the night had passed. The question on everyone's lips remained the same: what happened last night? And Daniel, walking quietly through the streets, carrying the weight of stories, memories, and trust, knew the answer was simple yet unspoken. Something important happened, something profound, something beyond explanation. And sometimes the most meaningful experiences are those that cannot be fully shared, only felt, understood, and carried in silence. By noon, life in the town continued. Shops opened, children played, and the sun rose higher in the sky. Yet there was a quiet respect for Thomas and for the events of the night. People glanced at his house with gentle curiosity, whispering to one another, sensing that something beyond ordinary had occurred. And Daniel, though tired and thoughtful, carried the memory of that night quietly, knowing that some experiences are too sacred to be shared with anyone else, but too powerful to ever forget. The morning ended with a subtle, unspoken understanding between the people of the town, Daniel and Thomas. Life would go on, yet the memory of the night lingered, a gentle shadow behind the ordinary routines. And Daniel realized, as he walked home in the soft light, that some nights leave marks not on the body or on the land, but on the hearts and minds of those who were awake enough to witness them. The sun was high now, spilling golden light over the quiet town. The air was warm, carrying the smells of dust, earth, and the faint scent of baked bread from nearby houses. Life seemed ordinary again, people walking to shops, children laughing in the streets, and neighbors talking quietly about their plans for the day. Yet for Daniel, nothing felt ordinary. The events of the night still weighed heavily on his mind, pressing gently but persistently, reminding him of the responsibility and trust Thomas had shared. After leaving Thomas's house earlier, Daniel had walked slowly through the streets, noticing how the town had subtly changed. People were polite, calm, but their eyes occasionally flicked toward Thomas's house. Whispers followed him, short questions carried in soft tones. Did you see him last night? Was it true? Something strange? What happened in that house? Daniel answered only with gentle nods or quiet smiles, knowing that the truth could not be explained in ordinary words. Some things were meant to remain unspoken, carried silently by those who had witnessed them. Returning home, Daniel tried to rest, but his mind refused. He replayed the night over and over, remembering Thomas's voice, the stories, the small gestures, and the moments of trust that had passed between them. Each memory was vivid. The way Thomas's hands trembled slightly when he reached for water, the soft rhythm of his breathing, the way his eyes held both sorrow and wisdom, the delicate carvings and faded photographs lining the shelves. Every detail seemed to carry a lifetime, and Daniel realized that this was more than a night of caregiving. It was a night that had transformed him. He remembered the words Thomas had spoken before drifting into a calm rest. You have stayed. You have listened. That is enough. You will carry it now, even if you do not know it yet. Daniel understood them now more than ever. He had been given a gift, not of stories he could tell casually, but of experience, understanding, and connection. These things could not be shared fully with the town, and yet their impact would resonate quietly through his life forever. As the day moved forward, Daniel noticed subtle changes in how people treated him. Neighbors spoke to him with quiet respect, their voices softer, their eyes thoughtful. Some did not speak at all, simply nodding in recognition when he passed. The question, "What happened last night?" lingered everywhere, but no one pressed too hard. It was as if they all sensed that the events were larger than simple curiosity, that something sacred had occurred and must be treated with care. Daniel thought about Thomas and the calm he had found by morning. The old man had changed in subtle ways too. His breathing was steadier, his eyes brighter, and a sense of peace seemed to have settled over him. Daniel realized that the night had given Thomas more than just care. It had given him witness, understanding, and companionship. And Daniel himself had been transformed, carrying both the stories and the quiet wisdom that came with listening. As the day went on, Daniel found himself reflecting on what it meant to be responsible for someone else's life and memory. The night had shown him that helping someone could be more than performing tasks or offering comfort. It could mean being present, being awake, and honoring the depth of another human being. Some of the stories Thomas shared had been painful, some filled with loss, and some touched with hope and beauty. Each had been important, and Daniel understood that his role had been to witness them, to hold them in his mind and heart without judgment or distraction. By afternoon, Daniel decided to return to Thomas's house briefly. He wanted to see the old man, to ensure he was comfortable, and perhaps to share a small conversation now that the tension of the night had passed. When he arrived, Thomas was sitting quietly by the window, looking out over the hills and open land. The sunlight fell across his face, highlighting the wrinkles and lines that told the story of a life long lived. "Good afternoon," Daniel said softly. Thomas turned slightly and smiled, a faint but genuine expression. "You've done well," he said, "more than you realize." Daniel shook his head. "I only stayed with you, that's all." Thomas's eyes gleamed with a mix of amusement and wisdom. "Sometimes staying is more than doing. Listening is more than speaking. You have given me that tonight. That is rare." Daniel felt a warm sense of fulfillment. He had entered the night expecting only to care for a sick neighbor, and yet he had been given a lesson in human life, connection, and the quiet power of empathy. It was a lesson that could not be measured or explained, only felt and remembered. As they spoke, the quiet town seemed to watch from afar. People passing by glanced at Thomas's house, their expressions curious but respectful. The question, "What happened last night?" continued to ripple through the community, though it was no longer asked loudly. It had become something unspoken, a shared mystery that everyone sensed but could not fully grasp. Daniel stayed with Thomas for a while longer, helping him move around the room, arranging the small objects and photographs in a way that seemed natural and comforting. Each object told a story, and Daniel handled them with care, aware that he was not just touching things but memories. Every photo, every carving, every small detail was part of a life that had been built slowly, patiently, and sometimes painfully. When it was time to leave, Daniel stood at the door, feeling the weight of the morning and the night behind him. Thomas rose slightly from his chair, leaning on his walking stick, and spoke once more. "You will carry this night," he said, "not in words but in your heart. That is enough. That is what matters." Daniel nodded. He understood. The night had given him more than he could have imagined. It had given him understanding, respect, and a connection that transcended ordinary life. It had reminded him that some experiences are too profound for explanation, too sacred for gossip, and too powerful to be forgotten. As Daniel walked home, the sunlight falling warmly on his face, he felt a sense of peace and purpose. He had witnessed something extraordinary, and it had changed him quietly, invisibly, but profoundly. He also realized that Thomas's life, his stories, and the night they had shared would continue to live through him. He would carry them, remember them, and honor them in small, meaningful ways. By evening, the town had returned to its usual rhythm. Shops closed for the day, families gathered for dinner, and the streets grew quieter. Yet in the hearts of the people, there was an unspoken acknowledgement of the events of the night. Whispers still floated through the air. What happened last night? But now they carried not curiosity alone, but also a quiet respect, a sense that some things in life are deeper than appearances, and that moments of trust and connection matter more than explanations. Daniel reflected on that as he prepared for bed. The night had changed him. He had entered expecting only a small act of kindness, and he had left with a profound understanding of life, memory, and the quiet strength of simply being present for someone else. Thomas had trusted him, and he had honored that trust. That was more than any words could describe. And as he closed his eyes, Daniel felt the night's memory settle over him like a soft blanket. He thought of the stories Thomas had shared, the river of memories that flowed through them, the life lessons quietly embedded in each word, gesture, and object. He understood that some nights do not end when the sun rises. They continue in the hearts of those who have lived them, quietly shaping their thoughts, feelings, and actions in ways that will remain for a lifetime. The final thought that lingered in Daniel's mind as sleep overtook him was simple but powerful. Sometimes the greatest gift is not to fix or solve, but simply to stay, to listen, and to witness. And in doing so, we carry something far more precious than we could ever fully explain. For Thomas, the night had passed with a sense of release, comfort, and quiet satisfaction. For Daniel, it had been a night of discovery, learning, and emotional growth. For the town, the night remained a mystery, a ripple of wonder and quiet respect that would linger long after the events themselves had faded. Life would continue, as it always does. But the night had left its mark, invisible but undeniable, shaping the hearts and minds of those who were awake enough to notice. And in the quiet moments that followed, Daniel realized that the story of that night would live on, not in gossip, rumor, or explanation, but in the silent understanding, compassion, and human connection that it had inspired. The night had passed, the morning had arrived, and the town had resumed its ordinary rhythm. Yet for Daniel and Thomas, and perhaps for anyone with the patience to listen, the memory remained vivid and alive, a reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of presence can carry the deepest meaning, and that some nights leave marks not on the world but on the soul. And so, with the last light of evening fading, Daniel sat quietly in his home, thinking of Thomas and the night they had shared. He knew that no one in the town would ever fully understand what had happened, and that was perfectly fine. Some experiences are too sacred to explain, too personal to share, but their power endures quietly, invisibly in the hearts of those who were awake enough to witness them. The night had ended, the day had passed, and yet its lessons, its stories, and its quiet magic would continue, living in Daniel, living in Thomas, and living in the gentle, unspoken understanding that some moments in life are simply meant to be carried silently, but never forgotten.